Your Creative Push, episode 279.
Pull up a chair at your table for your doubt. Give it a home, give it a place at the table because it's not going away.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngmin Brown, and my guest today is Jennie Nash. Jennie is a book coach, the author of 8 books, 6 of which were published by Big 5 publishers, and she is the founder of Author Accelerator. And she comes on the show today to talk about what it means to be a book coach and how she helps her clients. She tells us about the inspiration that her father gave to her as a very hardworking writer himself, and also her lifelong pursuit of trying to prove the power of story. She talks about how she became a book coach and what she does to help her clients, and also wrestling with her own identity as she shifted from a writer to somebody who helps writers. She talks about how the creative parts of our lives are mostly spent in solitude, spending time with just ourselves, just us in our own minds, and how, as such, anxiety, doubt, stress, and all of the other things that come with it are emotional resistances that all writers and all creative people will deal with for their entire careers and for their entire lives. Jennie talks about the importance of knowing why you want to do something creative like writing a book so that you can get through all of those resistances that you do encounter along your very long journey. And she also discusses how to determine or how to figure out when it's time to actually walk away from a project, temporarily or permanently. Just a really deep dive into the idea of creating something new, a giant project, and how to prepare yourself from somebody who thinks about this stuff all day and somebody who has helped many people to write their own first book. But this is going to be very inspiring for you, regardless of your creative passion. And I know you're going to enjoy my conversation with Jennie Nash. Jennie, welcome to Your Creative Push.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're very, very happy to have you on. I always like to give my guests an opportunity to tell their kind of backstory, a brief summary of how you got to the point you are today, kind of creatively speaking.
Yeah, well, I was one of those kids that so many writers are, the kind of under the covers with a flashlight kid. Yeah. And my dad was a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he was a writer. And we lived in a house, a big ranch house, and he would write at the end of the house in a study. And he had this green keyed typewriter, which I've come to learn was a very particular design that Olivetti had. It's this gray typewriter with these bright green keys. And he would sit back there typing, all the time. And I wasn't allowed into his study when he was working. But I would sit outside in the hallway on the ground, just listening. And I loved the sound of the typewriter. And I didn't know what he was doing really because I was too young, but I understood this basic idea that something he was doing in there was going out in the world and hitting people and impacting them. And that very early was just in my blood, that idea that was a powerful thing to do and that I wanted to do that. And that, like I said, it was just very young that it hit me. When I was in 4th grade in my school, we had an opportunity to write poetry and we were going to make a book. And this, back in the day, there were mimeograph machines that they spit out paper with purple ink. And so the teachers were going to make this book on these mimeograph pages, and we made book covers with crinkled tissue paper, and you could submit poems for it. I just thought this was the coolest thing ever. And yeah. I submit so many poems. I think half the book was mine.
That's awesome.
And they were probably terrible. I mean, for sure they were terrible, but it was that idea, like, I'm doing that thing. And I didn't still really know what it was, but it was that thing that I saw my dad do. And my dad used to always tell me So he was a professor of environmental studies, and he actually wrote a book that was quite seminal in the environmental movement called Wilderness and the American Mind. And it's this massively researched, beautiful piece of academic writing that crossed over into the trade and has this very deep, meaningful point about Americans' relationship to wild country. So he used to always tell me that there were only two reasons to write a book. One was that you did something nobody else had ever done and could write about it. And the other was that you researched that thing more than anybody else. And so therefore you had the authority to write about it. And that was what shaped my understanding of what writing was. And I have really throughout my whole life has been an exercise in proving that to be wrong. So my journey as a writer was sort of proving that there was another way, and that other way is what I would just call story, just the power of story and emotional connection. And my fight to write that way and to understand that other way and to see stories is what shaped my whole career as a writer and a book coach, and even as an entrepreneur now, that fight to see story.
Yeah, I was going to say I would kindly disagree with your father too, because I think a lot of time, I think that's something that a lot of people think too, regardless of kind of the medium, their creative medium is like, oh, I don't want to do this because it's been done before. But I think that when you can get like kind of bring your own unique spin into something that is kind of a universal thing, a lot of times you're able to connect with like the reader and make them realize that they've experienced this thing too. It's like you're able to put out your own unique way of living life.
Yeah, and really the time that we're living in now, this time of self-publishing and no barriers to being published, is really the end. I mean, it's not the end. It's the newest point in the evolution of what publishing really is. Because back in the day, where I think of the monks who would, the scribes, who would write out the prose and these special texts, and they were very precious and only the elite had access to them. And as time went on with the printing press and all the changes in technology and in culture that have impacted what writing is and how people access writing, who gets to read and who gets to read. Now we have these e-readers in everyone's hands, or a lot of people's hands, and the ability for writers to publish whatever they want, whenever they want. And that's just a massively huge change. And, my dad came up in a time when that still wasn't, we were closer in many ways to the scribes than we were to where we are now. So, it's a fascinating thing. And I agree with you, and I do disagree with him, but it's been a long fight for me to shake that off.
Yeah. Well, talk about your own writing then, and kind of how you developed as a writer.
Well, after that fourth grade debut, I began writing in college, and I had the opportunity to write a nonfiction long form project as a senior thesis at Wellesley College, and had a lot of support from some really wonderful teachers at that school at a time when writing was not really a thing that was a discipline or a department the way that it is now. And so I got quite a lot of feedback and training and practice when I was a student. And I went off to New York when I graduated, thinking that I was going to be a writer, and got a job at a magazine. It was a Slick City magazine that was owned at the time by American Express. They owned Travel and Leisure and Food and Wine, these very glossy magazines. And it turned out to just be an incredible experience. The people running that magazine were extremely well regarded in the world of New York publishing. Betsy Carter was our editor-in-chief, and she had been the top woman at Newsweek for many years, one of the only women in that organization. And she was just smart and savvy. And we were making this magazine with the most incredible writers and artists. And I call myself a baby editor. I was like an editorial assistant, and I got to see the way that writing gets physically made. It was still back in the day when the artists would be cutting and pasting copy literally with an X-Acto knife and fitting it onto the page. It was right when computers were starting to, be a thing. I was there right when writers would start sending in their stories on floppy disks. So I really got to see the physicality of the way writing is made. And I began to get assignments like write this caption, which is being published, my 50 words, and gradually moving up into more writing as I was learning the process of editing as well. And there was we had a back page in that magazine that was an essay format. And it was like an 800 word essay format. A lot of magazines still have that format. And the famous one is Oprah has her What I Know for Sure in the last page of Oprah. So we had that type of format, and I proposed a piece for it. And really, I don't know why I thought as an editorial assistant that I could do that. I don't know where I got that idea or confidence, because when I look back at that, it was pretty gutsy. And and Betsy gave it to me, approved it to me. And so I wrote this piece, and it was a piece about, I was getting married, and it was a piece about how I couldn't stop thinking about death. So this sort of how love and death sit so close to each other. And I wrote this essay, and I was 25 years old at this moment. One of the agents of one of our writers saw the piece and asked me if I wanted to write a book about, basically take that topic and write a book. And so the usual struggle that people have to get an agent or get a book, I just didn't have at all. It just literally was handed to me. And I went on to write that book. It was published by Crown, which was an imprint of Random House, and when I was 25 years old. And I sort of thought that that was it, that I was made in the shade, as a writer, and it would all be uphill from there. That did not turn out to be true. But I did have a very easy start. And I wrote my next book. I've written published 7 books, 6 of them with big 5 publishers. And I've written in many different genres, and it was all just a process of what sort of came into my life. So the first thing was that wedding thing. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 35 years old, breast cancer. And I had a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old daughters. And I immediately knew I was going to write about cancer. And I did. I wrote a memoir about my experience with cancer, and the story really there. I spoke before about this fight to see the story. I mean, obviously 1 million women have had breast cancer. 1 million women have told that story. And you know what you were speaking about before, why did I think I had something to say? The story that I saw that motivated me and that informed that whole process was that I actually found out that I had cancer because of a dear friend of mine from high school was dying of lung cancer. And it was because of her that I even sought help and medical help. And while she was dying, I was not dying. And that was the story that I saw, that juxtaposition of her dying and mine not dying. And we're so young. We both had young kids. And what did that all mean? So the ability to see that story and shape that story was what drove that book. And all the rest of the books were in many ways reactions against that. The book did very well. I ended up doing a national tour with Ford Motor Company. They were a national sponsor of the Komen Race for the Cure events. And they bought 100,000 copies of my book to give away at races and toured me around the country. And I spoke to survivors. So I was a writer, I was a speaker, I was out there signing my book and talking to people and being on TV. And my next book was in reaction to that. I didn't want to be Cancer Girl. So I wrote a book that was specifically designed to not be cancer. that wasn't a very good idea. It didn't do very well. I eventually switched over to fiction and wrote fiction and became a solid midlist writer, which is really not something many people want to be. A solid midlist writer. It's great, but it's also, it's great if you're not published at all, you're not being read at all, but it is also a kind of purgatory. And so then I tried to mastermind a bestseller and get myself out of the midlist, and that didn't work. So it was lots of just projects in reaction to other things, in reaction to life events, and always trying to see that story. I was trying to claim that space that wasn't research-based and wasn't action-based, but was emotion-based.
Well, do you think that the reason you have that like reaction where you're like, oh, it wasn't a success, or like kind of, I don't know, not shrugging it off, but is because you were trying to do something different, or you're trying to, get out of a quote, midlist writer kind of syndrome, and not kind of reaching into like what really mattered to you?
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. It's not a good way to create, to try to almost outsmart your own self. The only way to create is to go inside and write that thing that you want to write. And what's ironic is that in the work I do as a book coach, a huge part of what I help writers with is positioning their book in the marketplace. By that, I mean understanding the marketplace, understanding what else is out there, understanding what is selling. And I do that to help people understand their goals. And if your goal, there's so many reasons to write, and what your goal is for that work will in many ways drive where it's going to be in the world, how it's going to end up in people's hands. And if you don't know that, if you're sort of writing aimlessly, it's pretty easy to not end up anywhere. So as a teacher and a coach, I'm always talking about the marketplace, but not in the way that you and I are talking about, which is what will sell? What do people want? How can I game this? That's not my stance, but it is interesting that I guess I would call it failure, or, I'm not proud of some of those books that I wrote. They informed very much the rest of my career. And I think it just helps, it's such a process. Living a creative life is such a process. And there's so many ups and downs and ins and outs and things that happen that you don't expect, and opportunities, and you can't control that. And in many ways, I think all you can do is ride it, ride the wave, and whatever's grabbing you and calling you, grab onto it.
Right. So then did this idea of becoming a book coach, did that call out to you? Like, how did that process develop? And what exactly is a book coach?
Yeah, it's a great question. A book coach is somebody who nurtures a project or a whole career on a project management level, an editorial level, and an emotional level. So the three different things, emotion, editorial, and project. And it used to be a function performed within the traditional publishing houses. That's usually what an editor would do for a writer, and nurture those ideas and those projects along. And it just doesn't happen anymore. The publishers don't have the time. They don't have the capacity. They're really looking for what I call camera-ready manuscripts that are just ready to go. And that idea of a slow build is not really baked into the process anymore. And so book coaching has filled that gap, and it's a very new thing, but it's filled that gap. And it also fills that gap for people who are publishing on their own in any independent format, where they're not going to get that anyway from a traditional publishing house. And I became a book coach completely by accident. I was teaching at a UCLA extension writing program, which is the largest adult writing program in the country. And I've been teaching there for about 13 years now. But at the time I was pretty new. And a woman approached me, one of my colleagues approached me and asked if I would help her conceive and develop a book idea that she had. And her name's Lisa Cron, and she was an agent teaching a class at UCLA about agenting and about story. And she wasn't really a writer, and she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And what that was a strategic mindset, this ability to approach creativity from a strategic point of view and break it down and have a process that could be followed and could result in a book. That's the way I taught. And that was the stance that I had, but I didn't know that I was doing that. And I didn't know that it was unusual. Lisa Cron had a tough idea. It was the way she teaches story. She's a story coach, a story analyst. She's incredibly brilliant. And that first book was Wired for Story, and recently followed by her book Story Genius. But Wired for Story is a book about reading and neuroscience and the brain and how reading impacts the brain. So what can writers do with that knowledge? And it was very multi-layered, very complex. Lisa's mind it's a very typically creative mind, where she just sees everything, and she's got it all in her head, and it's just very hard for her to get it out. A book is an incredibly linear thing. When we read a book, you sit down, you start at the beginning, and you move through it page by page to the end. It's part of its power, the fact that a book is linear, but a book is not written in a linear fashion. And a lot of people get into trouble. A lot of writers get into trouble when they think that it is. And it can be made in the way that it's consumed. It's not, consuming a book is a very different function and process than developing and making that book. And so Lisa was really stuck in that non-linear, her thinking, her understanding of story, very non-linear. And so we had to make that into a linear thing. And through that process of helping her, I developed a system, a replicable system. And before I knew it, lots of people were coming to me for help. And I didn't even realize it was happening until I realized I wasn't writing anymore. I was just helping everybody else write. Everybody that I was helping write was landing agents and getting book deals. And I realized, oh, hey, I actually think I might be better at this than I am at writing. And I found some satisfactions to be the same, that just being in the creative process. It wasn't my creative process, but being in the creative process turned out to be what I loved. And that's how I got drawn into this world of being a book coach and starting a book coaching company.
Now, was that painful at all? Was there any type of resistance to jump into that? Like when you get that aha moment that you're seeing how good you are at this thing that is kind of relishing in other people's successes as well. Was that weird or hard for you?
That was massively difficult, and it remains difficult to this day. And I've added another layer on it, which is that now I'm the CEO of a company and an entrepreneur. And that's a thing I never thought about being. So
yeah, one of the hardest undertakings you can undertake.
Oh my goodness. So I've gone through all these transitions of identity, and yeah, I mean, I get very jealous sometimes of my clients. My own daughter, who's 25, works in the publishing world and is starting to write. I'm jealous of my daughter. I'm like, it's terrible. And I go through that, and I go through thinking that I gave up and that I quit, and I go through all the dark emotions. And, that idea of identity and creativity is so important. And every single writer I work with goes through this, where they're trying to see themselves as a writer. And so my trying to see myself as this person with a different identity, as a book coach, is the same type of process. And so it makes me very empathetic to writers when they say, well, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm any good. I don't know if anybody's going to care. Who am I to tell the story? I deal with those questions every day with people, because that's a huge part of what that resistance writers are trying to overcome is that identity. And, I hear people say all the time that you're not a writer until really until you get a book deal. There's a pervasive feeling that that's true. And people have to fight that. You're a writer when you sit down and write, and you're a writer when you are intentional and committing to that work. And, I was just talking to somebody yesterday, actually, who is going through this same identity problem. She's starting to think maybe she isn't going to be a writer. And she has a book that she's written that I think is magnificent. And she told me yesterday, she said, I'm thinking I might just send the email, a Word version of this book, just send the file to my mom's book club because they're all dying to read it. And maybe I'll just have an audience of 12 people. And I sort of thought that was just incredibly beautiful, that if you know what your goal is and you know what would be satisfying, that's what makes you a writer. That 12-person audience could make her a writer. And of course, I have this secret belief that they're going to get it and love it, and it's going to become this massive bestseller because they're going to tell all their friends, right? Do you have that too, right?
Yeah, that was my thought too. Sometimes you need that initial small audience to give you that encouragement to like really actually believe in this thing that you created,
Yeah. So identity, a huge issue for me and for all creative people, I think, and putting that hat on, I struggle with it every day. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do agree with what you said though, that for people that, you don't need a book deal. You don't need a publisher. You don't need anybody else to tell you you're a writer. You just need to put the work in and write. That's all you have to do to be typing and writing words and hearing that kind of therapeutic sound of the typewriter like you had with your dad, like hearing that sound and just hearing the progress, hearing the work. That's all you have to do to call yourself a writer. Just putting the work in is all you have to do to call yourself a creative person.
Yeah. And, I've thought a whole lifetime about that sound of the typewriter and how it just drew me in and what that was about. And, it's what you say. It was about somebody sitting in the quiet of their own mind, sitting in a room, typing out what was in their mind. And that the typewriter was the sound of that. But it was very clear that action that my dad was doing in that room was in solitude. And that's what writing is. No matter what else, that's what writing is. We sit in a room by ourselves and try to make sense of what's in our mind. And now that I'm, grown up and I've raised a family of my own and I've seen a lot of the world, I realize it's kind of a really bizarre thing to do. Not a lot of people are called to do that, to sit in a room by yourself and examine the contents of your brain. I mean, it's kind of strange. And so I think that's really what was calling to me in those green keyed typewriters, that it was a sound, to be sure, but it was a sound that represented that truth or that reality of he was sitting there making things make sense in his own mind, and then hopefully in the mind of others. It's a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah, it really is. Well, and I kind of disagree with you. I do think that it's not as rare as you might think, like for people to have that kind of calling. But it's just like the matter of people not doing it. It's kind of a brave thing to be able to sit in a room, and it's kind of like an ego thing. I think people think that you have a big ego if you put something out into the world and express something into the world, and a lot of people just put that off. And that's the whole point of this podcast, is to like try to encourage them that no, like you do have something unique to say, and you do have something that's deserving of being out in the world. Do you find that the emotional part of it is like the biggest hurdle that they have, or do you find that once they get past that, it's just on to like the basics of how to write a book?
Oh, it's such a good question. I think, okay, here's the thing. Project management is easy. It's just external logistics. And the mistake people make around project management is that they don't quite grasp what a massively big project a book is. And if anybody has a job in which they have to do a Gantt chart or a flow chart of a project, maybe a building project or a launching a product or, whatever big project in their work life that goes on for years, that's the same shape and structure as a book project. There's just so many things you have to do, but we don't see it that way. We tend to see it as one thing. I want to sit down and write this book. So the project management part, once people understand that part of it, I feel like it's easy because they usually have experienced that somewhere else in their world. And the editorial development process is not easy, but it's graspable, I guess I would say. It's teachable. It's once people understand exactly what a story is and different story structures, and they start looking at their work in a strategic way, most people can get the editorial idea of things, especially with a little light shown upon their work by a mentor or an accountability partner, or writing group, or whatever the external source would be. They're all the same problems, editorial problems. They're all the same problems. People come to me a lot for what I call a rejection audit. If they've been rejected a lot, either by agents or the agents taking a book out to publishers, and they want to know why. Believe it or not, sometimes the agents want to know why. And so I do a lot of that work, and I review a lot of manuscripts that are not doing what the writer wanted them to do. And it's not ever a surprise. There's a small number of editorial problems, really. And they're pretty easy to fix if people are willing to rip something apart. Same thing if you're building something up from the bottom up. There's a finite number of story structures or ways to tell the story. You might have an incredibly unique voice, or of course you do, or an incredibly unique style or format or idea, but there's still these basic level story things that appear in everything. So for me, the editorial piece is easy. I don't worry about that or get nervous about that. But your question about the emotional piece, that's the thing. That's the whole thing. It's all about that emotional piece. And if people can't, I don't want to say overcome, because you're not overcoming your emotion. If they can't understand their emotional relationship to their work and their emotional relationship to their goals and their ambitions, and if they can't get that together and understand that and work with that, they're never going to finish. So the emotional piece of what I do is everything. And for your listeners who are just starting out, or who are maybe stuck or struggling or just trying to get their first project off the ground, or obviously that's why they come to you. They need that push. The thing that I would say that nobody believes me, but it's true, is that even the most successful writers are having the same struggle that you are. It doesn't end. It's what the work is. And, I have the privilege of, at this point in my career, working with New York Times bestsellers and Wall Street Journal reporters and massively successful writers. And what they're going through is literally no different from what everybody else is going through. And they have, I would say, in fact, that their anxiety and doubt and stress gets increased because they often have this sense of, well, I did it once, but I'll never do it again. It was just luck. Or I did it once, but nobody will read me ever again. Or that was my one idea. Or I'm a fraud. All of that stuff, it actually gets worse the more success you have. And so what I wish people would know, the thing I would want them to know, is that struggle you're feeling, that doubt and that crushing emotion that you're trying to move through while you're trying to see this story. The emotion clouds it so much. And if you could just know that, like the image I always say is, pull up a chair at your table for your doubt. Give it a home, give it a place at the table, because it's not going away. And you might as well make a place for it and recognize it and know that it's always going to be there and make peace with it. Because it is the thing that stops everyone who gets stopped. It's, like I said, the project, easy. Editorial solution, easy. It's the emotion that's hard.
Absolutely. It just keeps coming back.
Yeah.
So you might as well get used to it.
Yeah.
Well, what advice do you give people then when the emotion keeps coming back to like keep the momentum going once you do start a project, whatever kind of project it may be, to just keep going?
Yeah. So the most powerful tool that I have found for that is something that might strike people as a bit unusual, but it comes straight from the Simon Sinek book, Start With Why. So that was a big, well, still is a big book in the business world, made a big splash, that a company needs to know what their why is if they're going to stand out. And Simon Sinek uses examples of companies like Apple and Nike. And, it's a little bit strange to take that concept into a very uniquely personal, creative thing that's made by one person. But I believe it to be absolutely true and incredibly powerful, that if you know your why, if you know why you're writing, and I don't mean why you want to be a writer. I mean, because why you want to be a writer, the answers to that are gonna have everything to do with, you want to be heard, you want to raise your voice, you want to have control of the narrative. Those are all very powerful and important things, but they're not unique to you. Every writer feels those to a certain extent, and
they can change.
Exactly. But the why I'm talking about is, why do you care about this particular story? Why? What about it is calling you? What about it is moving to you? Why this story? There's infinite numbers of stories. Why this one? And people usually, the thing that I love so much about what I do, but one of the things I deeply love about what I do is when people come to me and they say, I can't go on unless I write this story. Like, I don't want to die unless I write this story. I hear that all the time. There's a desperation in the people that come to me. And part of the reason for that now is that I'm really expensive. So nobody's going to come to me like without some super deep motivation. And so they're like, I can't not do this. I have to do this. It's making me crazy that I haven't done this. And actually that comment, I don't want to die unless I do that, before I do this. And so the very first thing I do is I say, well, why? And most of the time it's hard to answer. And it takes us quite a while to dig down into that. Like, why? What exactly about this idea? Why is this idea that causing you that much pain or that much, whatever it is, and get that deep, deep level why? And if you know that, and the first thing I do is I make people articulate it. I make them write about it. I want to see pages on it. And this is like the magic is, usually people write, it's somewhere between 2 and 5 pages when they're answering this question. And I never have to ask them to go back and do it again and go deeper. If they understand the goal of that question, it's the only piece of writing that I never have to say, oh, no, you didn't quite do this well enough, or you need to go deeper, or it's not on the page. It's like every time I read them, it takes my breath away, because people know that if they take the time and they are honest and they go deep enough, they absolutely know their why. And it's always so powerful. And it usually, the key to the entire project is in those 3 to 5 pages. It's just clear as day, almost all the time. And their why is going to inform the shape of the book, the style of the book, the genre of the book. It's so many answers are in that why. And it's also the thing that does, it's the only thing that keeps people going. So you can talk all day about habit, right? Like you've got to write every day, or you've got to write 5,000 words a week, or whatever thing, life hack thing that you want to put in there. You can talk all day long about that. You've got to sit in a chair, you got to do this and that. But if you don't know why you're doing this thing, when you're 2 years into it, or you're 50 rejections into it, or you're into it and it's out in the world and it's getting hammered in reviews or whatever, the negative outcome, if you don't know why you're doing that thing, you're not going to go to the next step. You're not going to go forward. I just find it to be unequivocal. You've got to know why. And so if you can, take 2 to 5 pages and write why you're writing that book. And again, not why you want to be a writer or how fun it's going to be when you get invited to Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, but why this idea, why this matters to you, why you care enough to spend this chunk of your life. You know that, and you can go back to that and look at it when things get tough. That's what's going to keep you going.
Right. Yeah. Having that central thesis statement, but really expanding it and having like a 2 to 5 page thing, I think for any type of creative person is an important thing. Not only will it, keep you going, but it will give you that motivation to actually wake up early and start it, or stay up late to do it, to sacrifice other things to get it done when you actually realize what this means to your life. Yeah.
And it's the intentionality that I also like, that when you state your why, when you know your why, when it's there on the page, clear as day, you're no longer writing in the dark or in a fog, or writing to figure it out, or writing because writing is fun or writing feels good. All those things are true, but you now have an intention behind it. I mean, there's plenty of time and space in a creative life to write without intention, and to find your voice and to find your way and to find your story. There's plenty of time for that. But I'm talking about motivation for completing a book project, which is a big project. That's the realm that I work in. Then that intentionality has to be there, and it changes everything.
And also, once you make it a real thing by writing it down, you can't hide from it anymore. Like, I think it's easy to just know in the back of your head you're supposed to do this thing, to feel it in your heart that you're supposed to do this thing. But then it's easy to use those resistances to stop you from doing that very hard thing of writing a book. But when you do write it down, it makes it a real thing that you're like, oh, damn it, now,
yeah.
now I'm accountable, and now I know that why this thing is so important, and you can't hide from it.
And then also when people say things, as people will do, that knock you off your game about, who are you to write a book? Or do you really think that could sell? Or do you really think anybody's going to care? Or, worse, every writer has heard worse, like you're being selfish by taking the time away from the kids. A lot of moms get that. Or, whatever the world is going to throw at you, if you know your why, you might not be able to articulate that to the mean person who's in your face, but you can articulate it to yourself. So the answer to, like, who do you think you are? Or why do you think that's going to work? The answer is your why, is because it matters to me, because I care for these reasons, and those reasons are not about the external validation the world can give you. They're about your own engine. And we always need to go back to that, because the world is a fickle place.
Right. Well, do you ever find in this kind of exercise that people do realize that they're not supposed to write this thing, that maybe they need to write something else, or maybe they realize that the motivations that kind of have brought them to you or to this point that they think they should write a book, they realize that those are kind of weak, or they're kind of ego-based or something like that?
Yes, I encounter that relatively frequently, actually. And sometimes the role that I perform for people is to give them permission to stop and permission to let the project die, or let it go fallow. Because it's as hard as it is to give yourself permission to write, it is in some ways harder to give yourself permission to stop a project. And people are often in so much pain if they've been hammering away at something for a long time, and it's not giving them the goal that they wanted or the satisfaction that they wanted. So we talked before about the 3 things a book coach does: of project management, editorial development, and emotion. And there are demonstrable things that go wrong editorially with the book. And there, if I get something and I see something and it's got what I would call a fatal flaw, And the fatal flaw is the only way to fix this is rip this back to the foundations. And sometimes there just is a flaw like that the writer just didn't see. And, if I reflect that back to the person, what I'm seeing and why I'm seeing it and why I think it's true. And they, the thing we then work on is, do you have the energy and the drive to fix this? Or are you done with this project? Can you walk away? And I help people go through the process of determining that. And it's really very simple. It's first you give yourself permission to walk away, even just for a week, or a couple weeks or a month. And can you let it go? And what does it feel like to let it go? And what do you lose and what do you gain? And those deep questions, which anybody can, of course, do for their own selves, but you have to be really, again, intentional about it. Like, I am not thinking about this. I'm not opening it. I'm putting the folder on my computer in an archive. I'm not going to go to writers groups and talk about it. I'm not going to go to conferences and listen to agents. I'm just not going to do it. And if you can walk away, I say walk away, because the time and effort and energy and everything that it's going to take to bring that thing up to the level that you want it to be might not be worth it. If you can walk away, do it. People do that. I help people do that all the time. And sometimes it sticks. It's not a trick to get you to then wake up one day and say, wait, I missed my book. I want to do it. That certainly happens, and it happens a lot. But it also sometimes happens that project was the project that you needed to learn on, or the project that you needed to do in order to get to the next one, or the project that needed to fail in order to open up another door. Sometimes the walking away is the powerful thing to do. So the discernment around that and the closing of the door, it is a very powerful process. And that's open to anyone. If somebody is really struggling and really feeling the weight of a project on them, that, writing is hard. There's no doubt about that. It is hard, and it is hard emotionally. It's hard for so many reasons. It's hard, but it shouldn't be painful. You can go through moments of pain and struggle and doubt and all of that, but it shouldn't be ruining your life. And if it is, you give yourself the permission to leave it, to walk away, do something else, go take a dance class, go, start a garden, do something else and see if you can not be a writer. And odds are very good that you'll be called either back to that or called to something else.
I love it. Yeah, you're like a relationship coach. Having to break up with you. Right?
It's totally true. It's totally true. And there's many, many days. I'm not even kidding. I don't go a week without making somebody cry. I make people cry all the time. And it's just because when they come to me, they're ready to get real. And I'm able to just ask them the questions to reflect. It's not like I'm some magic person. It's just that they come to me at that point when they're ready to hear it, usually.
Yeah.
And they're ready to be honest and to face the thing. And it's not easy. It is a relationship. Your relationship to your work is a relationship. And it's, for many people, the primary relationship in their lives, really. And all the things that go with relationships go with it. So it's big stuff. There's some days where I think they should really give me a license to do what I do.
Oh, I give you that license.
Right? I give myself permission. I have several clients who are therapists and who actually, are licensed to do this kind of work. And we always laugh, like, I don't have to go to school. I don't have to do all that, all those hours. I just get to. It's funny.
That's awesome. Well, before we get to the final push, could you just talk about Author Accelerator and what people can get from that and what kind of experiences you offer with that?
Yeah, so I started Author Accelerator to help bring these systems and strategies I have to more people at a more affordable level. One-on-one book coaching is expensive just the way any other one-on-one high-level help would be expensive, and it's not accessible to everyone. So I built this company and again, use my systems and strategies. And it's just been the biggest thrill, honestly, to bring this company to life. I currently have 26 book coaches working for me, and they're helping hundreds and hundreds of writers move through these processes. And we have our core program is a 6-month program that we call Manuscript Accelerator. And it's 6 months all in. You can't wiggle out of it. And we do that on purpose. We hold your feet to the fire so that you'll actually finish a draft of your book. And it's not a super sexy offering. It's not, we'll promise you a bestseller. It's not write a book in 90 days. It's not, it is not the promise of ease. It's the promise of you'll actually do it this time. It's the promise of accountability. And you work one-on-one with the book coach, and that you set a program and a schedule that works for you, but it's based on weekly feedback, on the page feedback, project management, and that emotional support through email and phone or Skype. And it is so powerful. It is such a thrill. It is so much fun to watch this work and to watch people unlock it. And we feel like we're offering something very unique and powerful and good. And if it feels like the thing that somebody needs, we welcome you to come in and give it a whirl. We have a 6-day writing challenge, which is the first questions that I ask anybody that I work with. And that the very first question of those 6 questions is why are you doing this? And so you can get into that challenge. I think we'll have the URL in the show notes, and see what it's like to answer those kinds of questions. And if you want to see what it's like to get feedback, we have some programs that you can do. You do that. We serve writers at every stage. So it's writers trying to get to the end of the rough draft, writers working on a revision draft and going out to pitch. We have full manuscript evaluations, full manuscript edits. We help writers at every stage, but our core is that 6-month stop messing around, commit to yourself, be intentional, and get this draft done. And I find that the thing that we celebrate in our company is people finishing their draft. And finishing a draft is I think, the best moment in the life of a book, because getting a book out into the world, again, is about the external validation, and we don't know. It's a roll of the dice, and there's luck and timing involved, but you have control of actually finishing a solid draft that people want to read. And that's the thing we really strive for and celebrate.
Excellent. And like you said, that will be linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/Jennie Nash, JENNIE NASH. Jennie, it is time for the final push. And this is where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today, and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their own creative passions.
Yeah, well, I would say really look inside yourself and know why you want to do this thing and why it matters to you, what it means to you to write this story and to bring this story out into the world, and get super clear about that. And then use that clarity to motivate you to do the work and to get that work out of your head and onto the page in a way that is as clear as you can get it. But knowing your why and having that as a touchstone is the thing that you need to see it all the way through to the end.
Absolutely. What is your why? Jennie, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for giving us that push. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
And you can find Jennie on her website, which is jennienash.com, JENNIE Nash.com. You can find her on authoraccelerator.com and on authoraccelerator.com/blueprint workshop. She has something special for you there. On Twitter, she is Jennie Nash, and we'll have everything we talked about today linked up at the show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Jennie Nash. Jennie, thanks again.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Jennie for coming on the show. I want you to remember your why, or get to your why if you've never thought about your why before, because there is no marching band, there's no giant parade of people that are going to congratulate you for doing your work when you do get that work done. Like Jennie said, it's you and yourself, it's you and your own mind, just trying to work out the problems of life and figuring out what it all means. So it is so important to figure out that why. And my challenge for you today is to do that. If you haven't done this before, whether you're a writer or not, take an hour or two, sit down and really write down your why. And I know for non-writers out there, it might be a very overwhelming idea since, you haven't had to write a term paper since high school maybe. But it's so necessary to do. It's so necessary to write it out and to spend some time with yourself just thinking about why this creative thing is so important to you. And as you're writing this thing, if you don't get emotionally charged up, or you don't have like chills or get verklempt or even cry maybe, then perhaps it is not the correct creative passion, or you're not doing it for the right reason. I think no matter what, you will get emotional as you really do flesh out why this thing is so important to you. It's impossible to not get emotional about it. If you're listening to a podcast about getting inspired to be a creative person or to get past your resistances, you obviously care a lot. So to be able to really make this kind of thesis statement for yourself, not just a thesis statement, but a thesis kind of paper, I think you will be doing yourself a huge favor. The scary thing, though, is when you do flesh it out, when you do come to terms with why this thing is so important to you, and you do define your why, you can't hide from it anymore. You will be able to get past your creative resistances much easier when you are armed with this kind of why. So that's a good thing, but it will also make it much harder for you to push this thing off when you realize how important it is. That's kind of a positive thing, but also now you are accountable. Now you can't lie to yourself anymore. Just a really powerful exercise, and thank you to Jennie for reminding us of how to get to our why. Again, you can go to authoraccelerator.com/blueprint workshop if you want to further pursue Jennie and her services. If you were very inspired by today's episode and you actually do want to write something, I highly suggest you check that out. We'll have that again linked up at today's show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/279. On next week's episode, we have Dougie Hoppus. Dougie is a dark fantasy artist. He's an oil painter, and during the daytime, he writes software for a neuroscience company. And he also got into his art again in his late 30s. So he is living proof that it is never too late to start a creative passion. He's got a lot of things going on for him, which we talk about at length in next week's episode. If you want to check him out before the show, you can head to his website, shadowmyths.com, and we'll have that as well as everything we talked about today, again linked up at today's show notes page, yourcreativepush.com/279. But that is all I've got for you today, so hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done. So go and get it done. Tap into that why, figure out why this thing is so important to you, and actually write it down. Write a term paper for yourself, and maybe even give yourself a grade. Regardless of what grade you give yourself, though, it will help you out immensely, I promise. I love you all so much, and we will see you next time if you need the push again. Bye, guys. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.